Welcome back, everyone, to Down Periscope, Up Periscope, Tales of Submarine Tours. Currently, I'm still working out some of the details on how this podcast will go and how the seasons are going to be structured and how I'll present the various topics and whether or not they'll be integrated into the seasonal structure. Of course, things will start getting more interesting once I bring in some commentary from other tour guides as well, but I'm currently in the process of getting all my field recording equipment all squared away. It'll be a little bit of time before that occurs, but in the meantime, on with the show. They say that those who can't do, teach. Well, that may have been true back in the olden days, but as a licensed educator myself, let me say that that sentiment is woefully outdated and out of touch with the modern era, and it needs to die. Preferably a slow and painful death. Those who say that in this day and age have clearly never taught in a classroom or an educational setting. But lo and behold, OMSI and the Blueback herself qualify as such an educational setting. It even has a .edu web address, and we are given edu email addresses. So, in this episode, I'm going to rhapsodize on about the reality of what is it like to be a tour guide on USS Blueback. First of all, let's discuss what does it take to be a tour guide on Blueback. Well, it's easy. As Lee Marvin said in The Dirty Dozen, just walk slow, look dumb, and act stupid. Officially, since 2003, tour guides on Blueback have been called quote-unquote submarine educators. The difference, though, is purely semantic. Simply put, we give tours on a submarine. But being labeled an educator, I guess, sounds more official. In my case, though, I just happen to be a licensed teacher, endorsed in social studies for the secondary level, so I'm a history teacher. But currently, I am working as a substitute teacher in addition to being a submarine educator on Blueback, but that's kind of beside the point. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Officially, the job description for a submarine educator lists the following qualifications. You need a high school diploma or a GED, 6 months of experience in a public-facing customer service environment, well-developed communication skills with emphasis on presentation and public speaking, the ability to pivot between individual and team-related work, model and support team dynamics between paid and unpaid staff, the ability to adhere to confidentiality, protocol, and community agreements, and the ability to exercise sound judgment while upholding integrity and ethical standards. Additionally, there are some preferences for people with a knowledge of military or naval history and technology, a demonstrated interest in history, working knowledge of one or more technical areas such as electronics, electrical, HVAC, information technology, plumbing, and or machinery, people with a naval or military background, and people with a developed knowledge of diversity, equity, and inclusion principles, as well as proficiency or native fluency in a second non-English language. Now, as stated, those things are preferences. They're not necessarily requirements. And believe it or not, you do not need any experience on submarines or in any sea service, be it Navy, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, so on, to even be a tour guide. Yeah, so you don't even need to be a sailor, much less a submariner, to be a tour guide. Probably because that would drastically constrict the applicant pool down to unrealistic levels. A number of the current tour guides, as of 2024, actually have no sea experience, and I myself actually have no experience working on submarines. In fact, the only operational submarine I've actually been on is one of those Atlantis sightseeing submarines. I took a trip to Oahu when I was like 8 or 9 years old. Yeah, and you go down a little bit and you look out the big windows and look at the fish and the reef and all that. So yeah, I was on that submarine. Furthermore, I took a tour of the Blueback when I was like 10 years old or something, which was probably like a couple of years after OMSI actually got the submarine itself. And I'll talk about those experiences a little bit later on in another episode. Now, furthermore, as stated in the qualifications, you do not need a college degree or a background in education for this job. But again, in my case, I'm a teacher, so I spend a lot of time in a room with a bunch of people relaying information to them. So I have the whole public speaking and presentation part down. You also do not need a background in engineering, physics, or any kind of science or mathematics to be a tour guide. Now, they do ask you if you have any mechanical skills during the interview process, and they do, like they said, have a preference for people with a working knowledge of those types of things, but the reality is they're not going to ask you to tear apart and rebuild the diesel engines or fix the high-pressure air systems or the electrical wiring on the submarine. That's not realistic. The daily maintenance the tour guides do on the boat is very, very basic. Mostly, it actually amounts to just changing burnt-out fluorescent light bulbs, replacing the old HVAC air filters, vacuuming the carpet, swabbing the deck, wiping down the surfaces, refilling the windshield wiper fluid, and rotating the tires on the submarine. Okay, I'm kidding about those last two, but the extent of the mechanical engineering skills that you need on Blueback to be a tour guide is just your average housekeeping chores that you would do at home. There used to be an actual maintenance crew, as in people with actual engineering and naval experience on submarines and ships that would come in on the days that the museum is closed, and they would do the more serious upkeep on the submarine, but the pandemic shut them down, and as of early 2024, they have not returned, but we're trying to get them back. Anywho, so back to being a tour guide, or submarine educator. Realistically, you have all those qualifications and some of those preferences and things like that, but what does it all mean? What does it all amount to? Well, in your day-to-day work, tour guides need to have a good memory, we need to have attention to detail, a reasonable ability to read the room and adapt to the situation. We have to learn a lot of information about the submarine. We have to be able to present that information with a good public speaking voice and be able to adapt the information to the needs of the tour group. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. So realistically, it starts off, you're going to welcome a tour group. You're going to move them from place to place throughout the submarine. You're going to give your whole spiel. Multiple tour guides are on the boat every day, so you rotate through the tour guides throughout the hour. So a single tour guide will usually give one tour an hour, and therefore multiple tours throughout the day. Now, there are actually two types of tour guides on Blueback. There's paid and unpaid, also known as volunteer tour guides. In practice, there is no difference in what they do. The only difference is that volunteer tour guides don't get paid and they can set their own schedule for when they want to come in. In that respect, actually, being a volunteer at OMSI is pretty nice. They are treated pretty well for being volunteers. There's a variety of volunteer positions at OMSI, not all of them related to the Blueback, and most of them are available to those ages 14 and up. However, if you are going to work with the submarine, then you need to be 18 or older. Now, every volunteer is going to go through your usual background check, and I think there's a short interview that goes on as well, but it's fairly easy to become a volunteer. Now, the two types of volunteers that work with the submarine are the queuers and the tour guides. Queuers are the people who are up in the main building. They gather up the visitors and they check their tickets, give them the safety briefing, and then send them on down to the submarine. And after that, a tour guide, be it paid or volunteer, is going to take over. Now, I can really only speak for myself, but generally speaking, though, most of us tour guides were looking at a couple of things as the tour groups come down the ramp towards the submarine. First of all, the size of the group. We need to confirm the number of people so that other people don't try to sneak onto the tour. Because for that period when they're out of the building, between the building and the submarine, occasionally some people try to sneak on board. And I could talk about that in a later episode as well. But yeah, so we're kind of confirming, okay, so they said there's going to be 10 people for this group coming down. So are there 10 people in this group? There's not 11 or 12 or whatever. We're also looking at the composition of the group. How many of them are adults? How many of them are kids? How old do the kids look, and so on? Is there anyone having trouble moving? Are there any people with disabilities, right? Now, I've seen a blind person come through the submarine, like both people with canes and people with service dogs. So, yes, it can be done. Now, once they get down to the submarine, and again, speaking for myself, I begin the tour and often ask if there are any military veterans in the group. And it doesn't really matter, okay? But, I don't care if you're in the Navy or Army or Marines or Air Force or whatever, it doesn't matter. But I'm looking for that, I'm also looking for any non-native English speakers, right? Is there any interpreting that is going on between certain people, right? Any foreigners or whatever that maybe I need to slow down for. So essentially the size of the group, the number of children, the presence of any military veterans or active duty military as well, foreigners and so on can greatly influence how I give my tour and present the content of the tour. And this is all done within the span of about 1 to 2 minutes. That's the whole read the room skill that you really need. And what it does is that it informs me of my audience so that I can give them a better tour, and if anything may need further clarification or things that maybe need to be left out because it's just not needed. The presence of a lot of little kids, for example, might mean that the tour becomes, a little bit squirrely later on. Now, in contrast, say that I get a tour group of 14 German engineers, well, then I'm sure things are going to get really interesting once we get into the engineering spaces of the submarine, and they're going to be having a lot of questions about the diesel engines and the batteries and the electric motor and so on. It's like, ugh, I don't know, I'm not an engineer. So let's talk about what the tour is itself. There are 2 types of tours. The standard 45-minute tour is offered every day, multiple times an hour, which is the most common. It covers 7 different areas in the submarine and is meant to give visitors a very broad overview of the submarine itself, as well as life aboard submarines. The other type of tour is the technical tour, or the tech tour, as we call it. That's offered twice a month, on the 2nd and 4th Sundays of the month. The tech tour is the proverbial deep dive into the submarine's systems and the history of submarines themselves. Those tours are only guided by volunteer tour guides who are submarine veterans. Currently, anyway. Now, I've been told that it's more cost efficient to have the volunteer guides give those tech tours than it is for a paid tour guide to do so. And furthermore, I'm just not trained for a tech tour, so I'm only trained to give a general standard tour. The tech tours are actually an interesting experience since they give visitors a huge amount of information. And while they generally last 3 hours, they're actually heavily dictated by the tour guide and the questions that the visitors ask. So, for example, the tech tours often have a lot of the submarine veterans on them because they've already been on submarines, they know what it's like, and they just have real specific, deep questions about the Blueback herself. Now, if there's any real downside to the tech tour, apart from them lasting 3 hours if you're in a hurry, but you should set aside that time anyway, but the reality is that the tech tours are constantly moving around because they need to make way for the regular tours that are also moving through the boat at the same time. So both tours are ongoing, and on the days that we have tech tours, you could be on one of the tech tours and all of a sudden the tour is going to have to rapidly move from one space to another because a regular tour is coming through and it's going to need that space. But still, the tech tour is the most information heavy of the tours, and a lot of people say that they really like them. They're a lot of fun. So how do tours, compare to a classroom setting, for instance? As I mentioned in the introduction episode, I approached this job more as a historian and as an educator. Now, since I have no prior experience with Navy submarines, those 2 fields actually inform most of my knowledge of this job. Now, I do have experience with boats and ships and things like that, but no experience with submarines. Well, there is a theory and practice to the act of teaching. It's known as pedagogy. And as described above, the tours rely heavily on the teaching method known as direct instruction. Now, for you non-teachers out there, direct instruction is known as lecturing. Now, I was going to go into a whole big spiel about how education has changed from your parents' and your grandparents' time, but here's the gist of it. You see, in today's classrooms, students are not just sitting quietly and passively listening to a teacher lecture on for 90 minutes non-stop. Direct instruction as a modality is somewhat discouraged in this day and age, at least in my experience, because, as they say, if the teacher is doing all of the work, then the students are not doing the learning. The reality is that they're not really listening to you, and they're on their phones or their Chromebooks, okay? Education today encourages more active participation and learning from the students themselves. So the teachers need to get the students to engage their brains with the material. And that's why teachers, ideally anyway, give students assignments that push them out of their comfort zone and force them to not only use what they've learned, but also to extend their thinking. Or for those of you who are familiar with educational theory, you might have heard of this guy called Vygotsky. Yeah, the zone of proximal development and all that. But anyway, so when your kid complains,
"Oh, I hate this assignment. It's too hard. We always have homework. The teacher never teaches."
yeah, well, that's because we're trying to challenge your kid to think and not just coast through life on their phone all damn day. That's not an education. So, how does this all relate to OMSI? Well, it's a science and industry museum, and its overall mission is to cultivate in people a passion for STEAM. No, not just STEM, but STEAM: science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. Now, OMSI is not a museum in a traditional sense like a history museum, with tons and tons of artifacts all sealed up in glass cases and displays or sitting in a basement archive. OMSI wants to emphasize experiential learning, so many of the exhibits in the main building anyway are very hands-on, especially the ones for the kiddies. Now that being said, not everything is hands-on, like they don't really want you touching every single thing. And on the Blueback, the tour guides emphasize a hands-off approach when on the submarine. There's actually only a few places on board the submarine where visitors can actually interact with things. And the simple reason for that is because it's still technically functional. I've been told that about 62% of the systems on the submarine do still function. And furthermore, it is an industrial environment. I mean, this is a warship designed for combat, not your own personal amusement. And thankfully, OMSI has chosen to actually keep the interior of the submarine as close to the original as possible. And I should also say the exterior as well, at least as she appeared at the very end of her service. The only real major changes to the submarine are the entrance and exit ladders amidships. OMSI basically cut a big hole in the side of the hull and installed some real steep stairs for visitors to get on and off the submarine. And these are also right next to the original entrance hatch anyway. And the reason for this is because the insurance company has a bit of a problem with visitors going through a 25-inch diameter hatch and up and down a 2-story vertical ladder. So I can't really force anyone to do that. Still, the experiential part, I think, comes from just having the mere opportunity to move around inside a real attack submarine. And that alone attracts many visitors, even if they cannot touch the buttons. Regarding the tour guide's role as an educator, we are actually here to give interpretive tours. And that's pretty loaded, that statement, interpretive tours. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a later episode. But essentially, each tour guide's tour is analogous to an oral history, or even a lecture, so to speak. It simply has the added bonus of giving visitors an experience of being aboard a real Navy submarine. The submarine itself is a big piece of physical history, so even though it's essentially a mostly non-interactive history lecture, getting a tour of a submarine is the most unique classroom environment you can probably find out there. Now, a word on pricing. OMSI is a non-profit organization, but don't confuse that with the term free. Now, if you don't know what the difference is between non-profit, not for-profit, and for-profit, look it up. It's pretty simple. The museum is ultimately a business, and they need to move tickets and make ticket sales and things like that. So you do have to pay for admission to the museum as well as admission to the submarine. It's not a free service. Now, a study we did in 2023 shows that out of the various submarine museum ships out there, at least in the United States, Blueback is actually one of the cheapest, at $850 a person for the standard tour, which is a flat rate for adults, children, and seniors. Now, as of 2024, that price still holds true. Other submarine museum ships out there often cost around $10 to $12 or more for one adult ticket. Some even actually go higher at $20 or $36. In another example, the 2-hour VIP captain's tour of USS Blueback in Honolulu, Hawaii, are guided by a former submarine commanding officer, and they cost somewhere in the neighborhood of like $600, last I checked anyway. Now, compare the VIP captain's tour on the Bowfin to the 3-hour tech tour on Blueback, which only costs $20 per person. And yes, one of our tech tour guides is a former submarine captain himself. So, I mean, in comparison, right? $20 versus $600, 3 hours versus 2 hours. Yeah, you're getting a lot of bang for your buck there. Although, if you really want to get technical, Blueback is not the cheapest tour out there, because that's actually the USS Nautilus in Groton, Connecticut, which is free. Here's the thing about the Nautilus, though. From my understanding, the Nautilus is run by the US Navy, and you're only allowed to tour the forward crew compartments of that submarine. In other words, you cannot go aft into the reactor compartment or the auxiliary machinery spaces of that submarine. The reason for that is because of the classified nature of nuclear power, including the equipment to control it in the US Navy, as well as the very low, like minuscule, levels of radiation in those areas, even though the reactor itself has been removed. But there's no real need to expose the public to that. But on the Nautilus, if you go on board, you can only visit the forward part of the submarine. Now, in contrast, you can actually see about 90% of the Blueback on a regular tour. The only off-limit spaces on Blueback are the dangerous areas, and those are places like you cannot go topside up on deck. You cannot go into the auxiliary machinery spaces, or shaft alley, as it's called. You cannot go down into the lower engine deck where the number 2 engine is, or into the battery wells, or up into the sail and onto the bridge. And even the tech tours cannot go into those areas, except shaft alley. And that's because the other places involve climbing up and down vertical ladders. And again, their museum's insurance company has a problem with that. That being said, I have climbed all over this submarine myself and into those areas, and I'm somewhat inclined to agree. Because, well, the older I get, the tougher I find it is to move myself up and down the vertical ladders. And especially when you're surrounded by hard metal surfaces, yeah. There's already tons of stuff on this submarine that you can use to give yourself a concussion on. We don't need visitors to be doing that, and we don't need to include the hatch openings to accomplish that task. So what does this all amount to? Well, all in all, being a tour guide on Blueback is a fun job. I've always wanted to work on a museum ship, so I jumped at the opportunity to work on this one. And I get to work with a group of really intelligent coworkers, and I also get the opportunity to meet a variety of different people on my tours. If they're military veterans, even from another country's military, then that's even better, since I know that they'll have an appreciation for the history and technology of the submarine, even those that are not sailors. Actually, I find the foreigners to be some of the nicest visitors I have on the submarine. Now, nobody's getting rich off this job, and in fact, I actually make more money per day as a substitute teacher, and of course, even when I was a salaried regular teacher as well. But the difference is that it's a unique location. Like, I get to tell people, hey, I work on a submarine. Let me explain. Now, as a team, as a crew of tour guides on the submarine, we're generally all unified around a single and clear objective. Like, there's no ambiguity in what we're doing. The content of the tour is very focused, and we're here to talk about the history, the operations, and the technology of this submarine. The tour itself is not beholden to whatever social agenda or political punchwords are currently in the public zeitgeist. A tour is a tour is a tour. And Blueback has been with OMSI for the past 30 years, as of 2024. And while some of the information and content of the tours have changed, the basic format of the tours has not changed. And I'm good with that myself. And I'll discuss more about some of the most common misconceptions I get about the tours in another episode, but more to come. I'll talk more about what the tours are like as time goes on. Now, this is not to say that OMSI as an organization has no internal political climate. I mean, it most certainly does. Everything like that does. But the submarine is actually minimally affected by it, if only for the fact that it's physically away from the main building. And us tour guides are perfectly fine with that as well. The only real downside, I'll say, is that we occasionally do feel kind of forgotten about in a way. It's like, oh yeah, you folks are down there on the submarine, right? We're in our own little world in a big steel tube all day. And furthermore, there is no working head, that is, a toilet, on the submarine. none for the visitors and certainly none for the tour staff. So yeah, I mean, in fact, we actually signed a petition to ask the museum to put a portable toilet down on the dock during the fall, winter, and spring seasons. Otherwise, in order to use the bathroom, we have to go back up the ramp into the main building just to, do our business. And if you don't know, then here in Portland, Oregon, it tends to rain a lot and gets kind of cold in the winter. So that's a little bit of an inconvenience. Now, in later episodes, I'll be sharing some of my frustrations about this job because it's not all sunshine and roses. But apart from a couple of those inconveniences I just mentioned, well, I'll just say that it's a really fun job to have. I get to work on a submarine. It's the coolest classroom I've ever gotten to work in. Anyway, I will see everyone later for the next episode.